All right, good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to restart our talking lectures because I hated the way the other lectures were going. Um, I don't feel like I'm getting enough one-on-one communication with you guys, and I don't honestly feel like I'm doing the job, and I don't feel like that's doing really a service to you guys any more than it is to me. So today we're going to start doing these lectures again and finish out the semester with collaborate type lectures that I'll put inside of the modules. And if you still want the PowerPoints, I'll keep doing the PowerPoints, but this is going to be the primary form of communication from going forward for everybody. Uh, Thank you for bearing with me through that little period where we tried the other thing. I just, you don't know until you try it, and I didn't like it. So I'll try a hybrid of it, I guess, at Northwestern, but I'm not going to do that again here with you guys. Um, so today we're going to talk about the United States Congress. We'll talk about their approval ratings in a minute. We'll talk about what they do in a minute. But let me start with Congress is one of the three co-equal branches, obviously. They're equal in power to the presidency, to the Supreme Court. But I like to ask a question on my exams about which branch do you think holds the most power? And the reason I ask that question is because there is a trade off between each of the three branches of where each one has staked out its own claim of power. Congress, as a body, has not done that really, in my opinion. But individual members of Congress have, like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, and the Republicans like Tom Cruise, Ted Cruz, and Hawley, and there are a few others, Mo Brooks, uh, Sheldon Whitehouse on the Democratic side. There are multiple members of Congress that have staked out their own kind of power brokerages within the Congress itself, but no individual member of Congress has the monopoly of power over the body, except maybe Speaker Pelosi, which love her or hate her, you got to admit the woman's freaking brilliant and how she can wrangle her constituency around, and it's a large constituency at that. And to be made speaker in non-consecutive terms, with to be elected speaker twice, not only is the first woman, but then elected again, and the second time that she gained the majority, that's not something that should be overwritten in terms of like historical significance. In terms of Speaker Pelosi, again, you can like her or hate her. She's certainly got a target on her back in a lot of conservative circles, but the reality is she's really politically a brilliant woman. And I could say the same about Mitch McConnell. In terms of the politics, they're both very brilliant. In terms of their morality, well, that's a whole different conversation that you could have about them. But politically speaking, you have to respect the way that they handle their individual constituencies. Now, that being said, let's actually talk about the workings of Congress itself, the main body. We talked about in chapter 2 the Great Compromise and how the Great Compromise set up a bicameral legislature. And the legislature being bicameral means, of course, that there was an upper house, which is the United States Senate, and a lower house, which is the United States House of Representatives. Upper and lower, it is a little bit more prestigious to be called senator than it is to be called representative. Uh, the reason for this is that you have to win statewide elections. Your responsibilities on the Senate side are more vast than the House side. There's a number of reasons why that's actually true, but anyway, I'm not going to get too much into the bicameralism because I've already made you read this in chapter 2. Um, we talked about how it all came down to representation amongst the body between the what is it? The Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Yeah. Larger states wanted more representation because they felt like they had more population. The smaller states wanted equal representation with the bigger states, and they wanted a uh, smaller federal government not able to override state authority. Um, I may have to go to my dogs in just a second. I'm sorry. Let's see. So Article 1 lays out the basic definition of, let's see. I didn't want to talk about that. Okay, so the bicameral system, and we'll talk about individually how bills are passed, but in the bicameral system, when a piece of legislation hits the floor, it can hit the floor in different phases in both houses. So, for example, the current infrastructure bill in the United States House is way more progressive than the one on the Senate side. You hear the word $3.5 trillion thrown around a lot when you're talking about this legislation, but if you actually listen to what Bernie Sanders wanted in the Senate, he wanted something in terms of like 8 trillion or 6 or 8 trillion at one point, and the 3.5 is Bernie's compromise. These things cover everything from pre-K for children, uh, free community college to anyone that wants it. Um, it covered, excuse me, uh, negotiations for Medicare to be able to negotiate drug prices. It covered, there's a bunch of things that it covered that were overwhelmingly popular amongst the country. But again, senators like Manchin and Sinema, Joe Manchin's argument is that he doesn't want the United States to start spending money on things that could potentially lead up to climate change. Was the other one. Climate change was the other big one. Senator Manchin believes that if you spend all this money up front, you're not going to have money on the backside to respond to crises. Whereas that's not what the bill is intended to. The bill is intended to mitigate the crises that Senator Manchin is so worried about. I think that's what what I think he's not understanding. This is my opinion now. If you step in now and say we're not going to allow climate change to go any farther, we're going to get serious, which to some people say it's 30, 40 years too late, but you can't do anything about things that have already happened. But if we go ahead and make it a priority now, we're not going to have to necessarily face what comes in the future. And if we do have to face what's in the future, we'll deal with it then. And that's from a disaster management standpoint, which is what I majored in when I was at West Georgia. That's okay. You do your best to mitigate as much of the threat as you can, and then respond to what actually happens. You do your best to be prepared as you can. But this idea that you have to hold something back while your society, the social safety net is being ripped apart doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't track to me. Now, again, that's a political argument and an opinion, but we'll get back into the actual uh, content here. So, for example, the House bill is way more progressive. The Senate bill has been trimmed down. When those two bills pass their respective chambers, when one passes the House and one passes the Senate, they must be in identical form in order to go to the president. If they're not in identical form, they go to something called a conference committee, which is members of both the Senate and the House that sit down together and negotiate ways to create an identical bill. They'll work out the compromises. They'll do all the behind the scenes stuff that nobody really sees. It's the idea of how the sausage is made. In the Senate side, there's something called a vote-a-rama as well. The vote-a-rama is a very peculiar thing that I've actually learned to love. It's a system where senators can actually propose amendments to legislation before it goes to full vote. And it allows them to attach things. We talk about pork belly spending, the pork barrel buffet, the individual projects that come back to districts. This is where that happens during the Votorama. And the Votorama is, if you've never watched one, you really should. It's worth your time. So there are two ways in which these two chambers are actually filled. In the Senate, we have representation. And representation meaning each state, 50 states, has 2 senators equaling out to 100 total senators. There are also 2 representatives from Washington, D.C., and 2 representatives from Puerto Rico. Those are non-voting members, so they're not counted in the official count. In the Senate side, you serve a 6-year term. Let's see. Originally appointed by state legislatures until 1913. The 17th Amendment was approved, and that allowed states to elect senators by popular vote instead of the appointment system that had been taking place before by state legislatures. Now, in Georgia, in the midterms in 2022, we've got one Senate race that is actually going, this is a special election, to fill Saxby Chambliss' seat that was vacated by Chambliss because of illness. He retired, and Raphael Warnock won the runoff in 2020 to fulfill the last 2 years of Chambliss' term and to run against an opponent in 2022, which is looking more and more like Reverend Warnock is going to run against former UGA running back Herschel Walker from the Republican side. And we'll talk about individual elections at the state level later, but Walker is going to be an interesting candidate. Let's put it that way. So far, he's been an interesting candidate. Now, in the House, your representation is a little bit different. It's called apportionment. Now, apportionment is achieved through the equal proportions method, which is a mathematical formula to allocate seats based on U.S. Census Bureau population data gathered every 10 years. We just went through a census, and the big hot button issue right now is gerrymandering, which we talked about during the voting chapter a few weeks ago. Now, gerrymandering is the process of actually redrawing districts inside of a state. Georgia did not add and did not lose any districts in the 2020 census. That's the good news. The bad news is that gerrymandering is about to take place on a massive scale. We know that Georgia flipped blue in the presidential election, right? The state is still overwhelmingly controlled by Republican members in the state legislature. This is partly because that Georgia flipped from Democratic control to Republican control in the early 2000s, but that's more from a late term party shift. It took a little while for the Dixiecrats to catch up and turn into full blown Republicans, but the flag issue drove that a lot. If you haven't read about the flag issue, you should read about that. I'm sorry, I'm getting sick too, so my nose is running. But gerrymandering, or excuse me, let me just start with redistricting first. Redistricting is where, after the census is counted, and we had the population data in Georgia, the state legislature that is in control of the House and Senate both send forth representatives to a committee that will redraw the lines for the state. This is done in a very partisan manner that has been found legal by the Supreme Court. It is okay to redraw your district lines in a partisan manner. It's okay. You can do that. Is it ethical? Maybe not. Is it legal? Absolutely. So they do it. Now, the result of that so far seems to be kind of non-controversial. It doesn't seem to be very. They don't seem to be hitting on too many things that you would consider red button issues right now. But there is one concern in around Atlanta where Lucy McBath and Carolyn Bordeaux, their districts in the House, basically they're trying to run one out, and it looks like it's going to be Bordeaux that they're going to try to run out, making her district a little less democratic demographically for now, but the change of how that party disbursement is playing out in Atlanta, it may not mean anything. So they're making her district, I think, a little bit longer and a little bit leaner, if that makes any sense. They're going to be drawing the lines out a little bit away from her county into an adjoining county to try to draw in some Republican votes, but it actually looks like the county that they're going to have to draw into because of the gerrymandering rules is actually going to be flipping Democratic in the next year or the next election cycle. So I don't know. We'll see. But anyway, that's how the House of Representatives is actually populated, is through that process of apportionment that happens at the state legislature level. You have individual districts throughout Georgia. There are 14 in all, 14 total representatives. Our representative, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I honestly won't discuss. She's a little bit crazy. At least my representative in Northwest Georgia is Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's a little nutso. I don't know who it is in Carrollton. I'm not sure who is the representative down there. But these individuals in the House was designed to be, when we say representative democracy, this is what we're talking about. These members serve 2-year terms. They are most directly influenced by public opinion polls. They are most directly influenced by policy changes. They are very, you could almost say, reactionary figures inside of government. When things happen, you're most likely going to see the House act first. It's, for whatever reason, it's easier to get the House to move on legislation than it is the Senate. I don't have a good answer for why that is. I would think with more people, you have more interest at stake. And in some degrees, that's true. I mean, you have different caucuses that flare up inside of the individual bodies of politicians, but none that really will not toe the party line if push comes to shove. So the House, like I said, is more likely to react reactionarily, I would say, than the Senate would. The Senate has been called the world's greatest deliberative body. I don't know why. There's no data that shows that to be true at all, but uh, they call it in myth the cooling saucer of democracy, which is just not based in any sort of reality. I would say it's supposed to, like, they take their role very seriously and how they had this vision of themselves. Like there's a joke around Washington actually that every senator wakes up in the morning and looks at himself and says, "You could be president one day." The House doesn't seem to have those ambitions. Everybody wants to be president if you're in Washington. Everybody wants that job. Uh, but in terms of these two bodies and in terms of the Congress itself, You have two completely different methods of thinking about legislation. That's what I'm trying to get at. The House is quicker to legislation, the Senate a little bit slower and a little bit more cumbersome. Um, the House is more likely going to give you things that are more individually important to people, whereas the Senate has got to think in the broader sense of this is what's good for the country and for our state, not just my individual district and my constituency. So that's kind of the difference between those two. Let's see. Okay, so the powers of the Congress itself. Um, there are, I believe, three types of powers. I'm pretty sure. I don't want to tell you there's four. I think there's three. Enumerated powers, implied powers, and inherent powers. We'll go over each one of those um, in detail right now. Enumerated powers are the powers that are listed directly inside of the Constitution that the Congress has. Um, let's see. I want to make sure that I'm reading these right. The power to levy and collect taxes, declare war, raise an army and navy, coin money, borrow money, regulate commerce among the states and with foreign nations, establish federal courts and bankruptcy rules, establish rules for immigration and naturalization, and issue patents and copyrights. Other powers, such as the ability of Congress to override a presidential veto with a two-thirds vote of both houses, are found elsewhere in the Constitution, Article 2, in case of the veto. And amongst those powers, the power to tax is quite honestly the most important power of the Congress. Without the power to tax, government couldn't do anything. It couldn't do any of the things that it is charged to do without the ability to collect money. It wouldn't matter what powers the Congress gave to it. It wouldn't matter what responsibilities were expected of it. It wouldn't matter. None of those things would matter if Congress could not tax. And taxation is theft. That's just not based in any kind of reality. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but everybody likes to live in society. You pay the taxes to live in society. You get, like John Locke says in his individual rights, or in his common rights of America, common rights of citizens, excuse me. We give up a little freedom in order to gain government protection. We sacrifice just a little bit of ourselves in order to gain government protection on the other side. That's the consent to be governed. That's the whole thing. Now, the appropriations power is a little bit different. That's the borrowing money. They together serve as one of the bigger checks that Congress has on the other branches of government. Congress has oversight power with money. They control the lights in the White House. They control whether or not the White House can turn the heat on in the morning or not. You know that you know. Congress also has other powers like impeachment processes. Um, only members of Congress can actually introduce legislation on the floors of Congress. That's another important power that they have. Trying to making sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, by the way, the United States Senate, when I talked about it being the upper chamber, one of the responsibilities the Senate has as well that is truly, truly important is that when a president is elected, they have the responsibility to fill federal vacancies throughout the government. There are many, many vacancies from one president to the next, from judicial appointments to cabinet appointments, all these things. The Senate gets the final say on who is or is not qualified or who will or will not fill that post. A president can't just name whoever they want to and then have a rubber. Okay, they're not supposed to have a rubber stamp. Sometimes politics comes into play, and a president will get a little pushback on some of his nominees, especially in the Supreme Court. But most of the time, cabinet members, federal judgeships, those things aren't really pushed back on that much. And the president is given a blank check to write in with a simple majority of Congress, whoever they want to fill in those positions. So that's an important power of the Senate. Now, we talked about the enumerated powers of the president or the Congress itself. The day-to-day functions of Congress aren't actually listed in the list that we gave you a second ago. The necessary and proper clause in the Constitution directs Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So laws that regulate banks, establish minimum wage, allow for the construction and maintenance of interstate highways, are all possible because of the implied powers. These are the implied powers granted by the necessary and proper clause. The bulk of what Congress does on a day-to-day basis is tied to this clause. And then the inherent powers are unlike either the enumerated or the implied power. I'm just reading in the book from this point, just to make sure that I'm doing this right. Inherent powers are not only mentioned in the Constitution, excuse me, but they do not have a convenient clause in the Constitution to provide for them. They are the powers that Congress has determined it must assume that the government is going to work at all. The general assumption being that these powers are so necessary to any function in government that the framers saw no need to spell them out, like controlling borders of the states, the power to expand the territory of the state, and the power to defend itself from internal revolution or coups. These powers are not granted to the Congress or to any other branch of the government for that matter, but they exist because the country exists. Let's see. Marbury versus Madison is the first true challenge to congressional authority that exists in the record of the Republic. Marbury versus Madison allowed the Supreme Court to insert itself as a check on the Congress in the form of judicial review. They then assumed the power at this point to declare laws unconstitutional. Judicial review is what the Supreme Court is known for now, but when it was created, it was not created for that purpose. And we'll talk about that more specifically when we talk about courts. Now, like I said in the beginning, the presidency was a fairly weak. Each branch of government has tried to insert itself into the powers that Congress has, including the presidency. Let's see. So, like for example, the president is generally most powerful during wartime, and Abraham Lincoln is a classic example when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He also issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a stretch of presidential power. It was a good stretch, history says, but at the time was a big stretch of presidential power. In the modern day, Congress and the president are still struggling with each other. As the country grew larger, the president and the Congress began to struggle over how much regulatory power they held over each other. In theory, the presidency with the hierarchical structure, basically the president sits at the top and everybody underneath the president is working for the president. One of my favorite scenes in the West Wing series is I serve with the president. I serve with the pleasure of the president of the United States, and that's true to every degree of administration. You do not serve at your own pleasure. You serve at the pleasure of the president. And we'll dig into that a little deeper next week. But this makes the policy making and the gears of government function a little easier in the executive realm than it does the Congress. Let's see. So the presidency really took hold of congressional power during the 1930s with the Great Depression and World War II, in the 30s and 40s with FDR. FDR really took hold of power inside of the executive mansion or the White House. And as a result of that power, I mean, FDR was elected to 4 consecutive terms. Or was it 5? 4 or 5? I think it was 4. He served 3 and only lived and served. Yeah, I think it was 3, elected to 4. He died before in the middle of the 4th one. Right. But the 22nd Amendment only allows presidents to serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms or 2 non-consecutive 4-year elected terms at any given time. So the presidency also inserted itself into wartime struggles like Korea, Vietnam, the war on terror, the drone strikes that the Obama administration picked up from the Bush administration, the killing of Soleimani that the Trump administration fulfilled, the Biden pullout of Afghanistan. Remember, only Congress can declare war. Remember that. But when wartime happens, the president gains a lot of power as commander in chief of the armed forces. And that can lead to some serious headaches amongst the legislature. All right, let me pause this for 1 second and I'll be right back. I'm going to let my dogs in. Okay, so in order to be elected a member of the House or Senate, you must be a United States citizen at least 7 years standing and at least 25 years old. Senators are required to have 9 years standing as citizens be at least 30 years old. Representatives serve 2 year terms. Senators serve 6 year terms. There are no term limits for either senators or representatives. There is a large national debate over whether or not term limits would be a good thing for the Congress. The way that I think about it is this way, and I was taught this way from Dr. Fleming at West Georgia. If you allow term limits, there is constant turnover inside of the body. You're going to lose professional politicians that know how the process works and are able to deliver things that need to be delivered to their constituencies in favor of more reactionary political figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene or like others inside of her caucus, Lauren Boebert or don't start, or Jim Jordan or any of the other vocal, more members like that. I used to take that and think, okay, the loss of professionalism, that's enough of a reason to not want term limits. I don't know that I feel that way anymore. I don't know that that loss of professionalism is enough for me to say that this is too much. I don't know that I can say that anymore based on the way that Congress is currently operating. If more turnover in Congress is conducive to more and better policy, then I'm willing to trade that, to trade term limits for that. But I don't know. I think term limits could also be an answer to the money problem in Congress. It could also be a very big detriment that whereas a person that is in Congress and doesn't have a term limit over their heads might be willing to stand on principle alone. Someone that's facing a term limit is going to try to make money where the money's good. I guess you could make the alternative argument that, when they leave Congress, they become lobbyists to make their money that way. That's what happens now. I don't know. Let's get back on topic, I guess. House members are elected by voters in their specific districts. There are currently 435 congressional districts in the United States, and therefore 435 House members. These members are, again, selected by proportions of populations inside of the United States, but I think the number of House members is capped at 435. I don't think it'll get any bigger if the populations get bigger. I think they redistribute the 435 based on how they need to. They have a formula for it. I don't know what it is. And then again, each state, 50 states right now, 100 senators, easy. You're elected by popular vote inside of your state. Now, the House of Representatives has developed a stronger and more structured leadership than the Senate. Again, House members are more responsive to their constituencies because of their 2 year terms. A popular political argument is what is good for the people of Wisconsin is not good for the people of Georgia. That's true, and that rings true most significantly in the House. Members of their own caucus can split on certain issues because, again, what is good for Wisconsin is not good for Georgia. And that, again, is what makes Pelosi so damn good at her job, is that she makes sure that everybody comes along, no matter what the issue is, it's good for everybody. She makes it good for everybody. So the Senate, on the other hand, they are a little more removed from their constituencies. Uh, they are removed from the way public opinion can sway on certain things. The rules of the Senate, the filibuster, basically allow senators to either slow down or outright block legislation that they don't like. There is no such mechanism in the House. In a different lecture, we're going to talk about the individual mechanisms, because I'm going to get really deep down into it so that you can really understand what's happening. And when you get mad at Congress, you can actually have a reason for why. But today we're just doing the structural differences. And we'll talk about the filibuster in particular. The filibuster, as it's currently constructed, requires a 60-vote majority to break a filibuster. The last filibuster-proof Congress was in Obama's era, I believe 2012. The filibuster is not constitutional. The filibuster is a rule that was created during the Jim Crow era to stop civil rights legislation. Its origins are based in hatred of Black people and minorities. Its origins are in racist in nature, and anybody that says any differently, that it is a tool to stop the radicalisms or parties from doing whatever they want to do, they have no sense of history, quite frankly. Senator Manchin, I'm looking directly at you when I say that. You, sir, have no sense of history. I don't care if you mentored under Robert Byrd, the creator of the damn thing. I don't care. The filibuster is bad. The filibuster is very bad. It could be used for good, but in its current construction, it is bad, and it needs to change. And I'm optimistic that it will change in the next, hopefully, several months for voting legislation, which we probably need to talk about. Georgia's voting rights bill, and the big lie. We probably need to talk about that, I guess. We'll talk about that another time. Let's talk about congressional campaign funding. I don't ever teach campaign funding that much. I don't think it does you any good to know the ins and outs of campaign funding. What I want you to know about it, though, is that it is the most shameless thing that you can do. It is the hardest thing to do, I think, in politics, is to stand in front of a crowd and ask for money. We have created a political system that responds to money. And as much as we bemoan it as individual citizens, we're the ones that amplify it. We vote based on name recognition and not on actual policy. We don't hold our legislators' feet to the fire. We don't do the things that we say that we're going to do, or the way that I think elections should work is that if a senator or a representative doesn't do what they're supposed to do, they should be voted out of office. Period. Now that comes down to the constituency being able to do that. Now, that's a harder thing to do. And when you get ads that are thrown at you night and day on TV about radical liberal Raphael Warnock or uh, Jewish space laser, Jewish space laser crazy Marjorie Taylor Greene, or Lucy McBath's dead son in Atlanta, or when you just get completely inundated with these political ads, you're just tired of them and you want them to be over, and you just go into the voting booth and you just vote for the person that you know the most about, or the campaign ads that they're most aesthetically pleasing to you, and you don't know anything about their platforms and you don't know anything about their policy positions other than they're a Democrat or they're a Republican. That is doing yourself and your constituency and everybody a disservice. And it's not your fault. I don't think it's your fault at all. I, I think it's the fault of the media to some degree for being dishonest. I think it's the fault of the politicians for not giving you straight answers and just saying things that are going to get them elected. I think it's the fault of these idiotic, just so idiotic political atmosphere that we put up for ourselves, where we separated ourselves into two camps of Democrats and Republicans and not as just straight Americans. There's no longer we agree on where we want to go. We just disagree on how to get there. That's gone. There is no more agree to disagree. And when people say that we just agree to disagree on this issue, you don't. Not anymore. Because you're holistically different in how you believe or believe in the thing that you disagree with. Like it's just a completely different world now than it used to be. One of the reasons that money has become so inundated in our politics is because of a decision from a place called Citizens United. It was a lawsuit against the FCC filed by Citizens United, which is a nonprofit organization that wanted to advertise a documentary critical of former Senator and Democratic hopeful Hillary Clinton in 2008. The film was prohibited by campaign finance legislation that had been championed by John McCain earlier in his career. The Supreme Court decided that the Citizens United position was that they wanted to advertise and spend as much money as they wanted to, and that constituted their free speech. The Supreme Court agreed with them, and we now have this system where you can just, a corporation can spend as much money as they want on a political candidate through a political action committee or a super PAC, and that is considered speech. Now, is that really speech? I don't think so. But it's the corporation saying we speak for our workers by using money that we get from our profits to support candidates. And that is just I can't get there. So now the incumbency effect is also something that is important to understand, especially on the House side. It's something like you have to make $10,000 a day from the day that you're elected in order to stay in office in the United States House. And that is something that is painfully borne out through the level of campaign calls and the amount of time fundraising that a normal member of Congress has to do. I mean, the National Party actually schedules time for them in a call center across the street from the Rayburn Building in Washington to actually do nothing but fundraise. There is no time to actually do any of the work that they're there to do because they got to fundraise for the next election. It's a really, really, really screwed up system. And it makes, when you're in this system as well, the incumbency effect has the ability to show you uh, donors that are more willing to give to you. You know how the fundraising works. You know how Washington works. You've got access to better polling data than somebody that's challenging you doesn't have. You've got better national presence, more access to news or to cameras than anybody else has. There are certain advantages to being the incumbent that should not be overwritten in this lecture. Now, the other problem that comes from that is that when you're challenged at the primary level and you're the incumbent, usually that challenger forces you to go to the left or to the right, depending on your ideology or where you want to be as a member of Congress. Or maybe where you are currently, they want to run farther to the right of you in order to try to encourage people to vote for them because they're willing to do the things that you won't do. That's harmful, very harmful, in my opinion, to actual uh, governing. Now, is this an impossible situation? No. Incumbents can be beaten. We've seen it in the 2018 midterms, especially when AOC knocked off that guy from New York that she knocked off. Rashida Tlaib knocked off an incumbent. Eric Cantor, who was the presumed speaker at that time, got knocked off in one of his elections in 2012, I think. No, it was 2016 that Eric Cantor got knocked off. Now, we're coming up on the midterm elections, and when we're talking about elections, it's a good opportunity to talk about the surge and decline theory in terms of the United States House. The surge and decline theory is Angus Campbell proposed it in the 1960s. With the exception of 1934, since the Civil War, the president's party, so the Democratic Party, will lose seats in the House of Representatives during the midterm elections. This has been true in every election except for maybe one, which I think was 1996 with Bill Clinton, but I don't think that was a midterm. It might have been 94. Yeah, 94. The 94 midterms, Clinton actually gained seats, but that was one anomaly of, it doesn't happen that often. Midterm elections generally, when you don't have the president on the ticket, when you don't have the national party on the ticket, it seems like opposite party ballots and the opposite party of the president, so it could be the Republicans, are more motivated to vote in this year's midterms than Democrats will be to outvote them and keep their incumbents in office. Midterms generally had lower turnout, which I'm actually going to show you some turnout data in the next lecture. I'm going to wrap this one up pretty soon because it's already been an hour. Turnout is one of the bigger questions in terms of midterms and voting in general. 63% of the voting population, of the eligible population to vote, voted in the 2020 election. Now that's just 63% of those that were eligible. We don't know the number of those that were non-eligible that just didn't vote at all. That number was probably somewhere in the 40s or 50s. democracy depends on participation. And if you're only drawing 60% of registered and eligible voters to the elections in presidential years, and you already know that a midterm is going to be an off year, and you're already having troubles when you're a president, you've got to be worried about the midterms if Joe Biden right now. And that's just an objective political scientist standpoint. You've got to be worried a little bit about what comes next. Okay, so it's been an hour. I'm going to stop lecturing now. A, because my voice is going to give out soon, and B, because the next sections of this chapter are about representation and I believe approval ratings, yeah, and organization. So we'll talk about representation and organization on, I might try to do it tomorrow. We'll do representation, organization, and then how a bill becomes a law. I'll show you that turnout data, and then we'll call that a day. Make sure that you're doing exam 2, please. I will have this posted in the module. Kaylee, if you need to listen to it again, I'm sure you love listening to my dulcet tones all afternoon. Do you have any questions before I go?
So if I can't make it to the live one tomorrow, can I, so you said just watch it, right?
It'll be in the module. You don't have to worry about being here every time.
Okay.
If you want to be here, you can be here, and I'll be happy to let you know when I'm doing it. I can't make them mandatory because with so many kids or so many people needing to be there, you know, everybody's going to have a conflict. So I just do them when I can do them, and we worry about the rest later.
All right.
So if you can be here, great. If you can't, that's fine too. I don't mind actually teaching to an audience or teaching to a blank screen. I don't care.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Have a good day.
You too.
Everybody else also have a good day. If you want to come to these live recordings, I'll put out an email next time for everybody. As for today, I'll send you an email later telling you that this is in the module, so you'll be able to see that. Do chapter 2's test, and go do something nice for somebody today because it's not that hard to do. Oh, and by the way, the Braves won the World Series last night. Go Braves, chop on. I'll see you guys tomorrow.